Great. Yeah, so just to repeat, my name's Taylor Barnes. I'm the field reporter for the Military Industrial Complex at Inkstick Media, a nonprofit outlet that covers foreign affairs and national security from a public interest perspective. And tonight I want to walk through two stories that I've done about subsidies to Raytheon in North Carolina and to Northrop Grumman in Utah for its new intercontinental ballistic missile plant. And the first story, of course, is how I met Ken. So you'll see sort of on the left of the screen, Ken's group protesting the project in Asheville. And then on the right, this is sort of a version of a ribbon cutting picture that involves Northrop Grumman CEO, Utah's senators, and several state level politicians, quote, inaugurating part of the ICBM facility. Hold on. Excuse me. So tonight we're talking about subsidies to military contractors. So what's the problem? What are we trying to solve? What information are we trying to get? If you're here in this webinar, you probably are well aware of how job creation claims are a very powerful political tool that major defense contractors use to sort of strengthen their hold on the national budget and, of course, to influence policies relating to war and peace in the United States. The Lockheed Martin will widely advertise how many jobs are tied up in the F-35 program. But what can we, an average person or a journalist, do? That's a private company. We can't go inspect their payroll. We can't go see if those job creation claims are true. So the problem is sort of lack of transparency. I included sort of here two quotes from books that I've liked that have addressed the topic. One was called Sustainable Regeneration of Former Military Sites. And it said, quote, "The American people care most about jobs and not any other policy. According to a 2014 report by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, protecting the jobs of American workers has been among the top foreign policy goals considered, quote, very important in all 14 surveys since 1974, placing first in no less than 8 polls, higher than preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and combating international terrorism." And on the surface, this is kind of funny because, of course, the spread of nuclear weapons is more important than our jobs. But this just intuitively resonates with me. I know this is what voters care about. This is what constituents care about. When members of Congress come back to their district, this is what they're talking about, what jobs they've created. I tweeted this passage from this book maybe a week or so ago and got a nice response from another user who said, well, if nuclear war breaks out, what am I going to do if I don't have a job? Then after that, I have a passage from Bill Hartung. Many of you guys may be familiar with his work from his book about Lockheed Martin, and where he describes why all corporations will use the jobs they create on the local level to their power, but it's particularly potent for military contractors. He says many government programs whose impact is more dispersed, military contracts generate jobs in large identifiable locations that can be directly linked to decisions made by the president and the Congress. And I think this gets to why, like I said, job creation is so salient, both for military contractors and then for their boosters in Congress who vote for ever higher military budgets and who put out press releases every time they do so, telling their constituents, hey, here's what I brought home from you, XYZ, this company, that company, and this many jobs. So what can we do about that? We don't have many tools to scrutinize those claims. However, we do have one nice one. So many of these military contractors, when they approach state and local governments, ask for subsidies. That then means the public is subsidizing them. We're on the hook for them. Therefore, we get to go to our local governments and ask for the documents backing that up. So the umbrella term for the kind of documents that's involved is an economic development agreement. And this would be, for example, if let's say Raytheon wants to switch its engine parts plant from, Connecticut down to North Carolina, tells North Carolina, okay, I'm coming to town. What can you offer me? What can you do to incentivize me? And North Carolina offers a series of subsidies to do that. Taxpayers are on the hook for that. And they draw up an economic development agreement. And this agreement, when the public gets their hands on it, can tell us a lot of things. It can tell us you'll see the headline in the local media, you'll see the press release saying something along the lines of like, may create up to 800 jobs. That's the one, that was the go-to line for Raytheon in North Carolina. When you read the fine print of the agreement, you might see it's not quite that. So as Ken knows very well, and many people on this call, the actual economic development agreement with Raytheon North Carolina is pretty slippery, and it looks like it actually may be an agreement more for about 525 jobs, if even. It'll give you some information about the time frame of those jobs. So for example, the one I'm looking at in Utah for Northrop Grumman has a headline figure of saying this will involve may create up 2,250 jobs over 20 years. So it's like, okay, is this a factory teeming with people? So many people getting jobs? Is this a bunch of temporary construction jobs? And then it goes down. What does may create actually mean? So when you actually get the agreement, you hopefully will get some information about the time frame and whether there actually is a high number of people or if there's a big drop off. There will be information on the average wage, usually. I mean, the state and local governments theoretically are subsidizing these companies in order to bring, quote, good jobs to town. But as we all know, and as Ken has pointed out in the Asheville context from the beginning, citing just the average wage of a job is not a particularly meaningful piece of information, even though it's routine in these kind of deals, because it's very easy to game your average. If you have a few high earners at the top, you can bring the bottom up. So anyhow, if you get your hands on this deal and you look at what the average wage is, you can interrogate that a little bit and say, okay, but are ordinary workers actually making so much? The more interesting piece of information would be if these deals actually give a median wage, because that would more accurately represent what ordinary workers make. You'll learn how much your state or local government is actually subsidizing the company. And when you read the fine print, like Ken has done in Asheville, you can see if the subsidy actually really does depend on job creation or not. So when you get into the fine print of the Raytheon deal, it honestly spells out how the number of jobs created isn't actually what is mostly responsible for the company receiving a subsidy. It's actually for them investing in their capital investment and equipment. I also wanted to note that economic development agreement is just the umbrella term for these. When I've requested these in a variety of locations, one time it was called industrial development agreement. In Utah, it's called EDTIF, economic development tax increment financing. However, I found that if I approach a local official and I suspect they have some sort of contract with the company, if I just say, may I have your economic development agreement with XYZ company, everyone knows what I'm talking about. So what do these economic development agreements look like? Here's the example of Raytheon in North Carolina. It kind of starts off with this sort of basic, list of, the narrative of what this project may do. So you see, I'm saying Raytheon is the parent company. It's the division Pratt & Whitney, which is opening an engine parts plant in Asheville. You see Pratt & Whitney, quote, desires to, quote, create 750 new full-time project-related jobs. Later on, may have an additional 50 new full-time jobs. Already this starts giving you information about how the headline 800 number that you see in press releases in the media could be inflated. I highlighted the second to last part because this is kind of the crux of these economic development agreements. Pratt & Whitney informed the county that if the county did not promise economic development incentives, then Pratt & Whitney may not locate the project in Buncombe County. So this is the company saying, I have other options. I didn't have to bring my factory to you. But as you can see, the public doesn't have much way to verify that. Like, really? I don't know. How are we supposed to know that you are secretly going around the country advertising yourself, marketing yourself to other areas? So they just kind of affirm it and you just take their word for it. Then finally, as I said, you can see sort of the maximum subsidy amount, which I also highlighted here. And this is just the top of the agreement. So I believe this Raytheon one was in the 20-ish page range. What was also interesting that comes in later finally is a detailed breakdown of the job creation projections that the company needs to meet in order to receive the subsidies laid out by the county. I only didn't include this in the slide because it's a little too much information. It was pretty busy, but that's how people like Ken and myself, upon analyzing it, could see that this 800 jobs number really did not reflect what was actually written in the agreement. It looked like an agreement for a plant that may, in the best case scenario, employ about 525 people, which I said already starts to change the narrative about, what these companies are doing at the local level. So here's the one I got from Northrop Grumman in Utah when I requested the EdTIF agreement. So I highlighted the word Project Unity because often these economic development agreements, will involve quote code names because the company will require local officials to sign non-disclosure agreements, so they can't openly say Northrop Grumman is coming to town. So they work under these code names. I think we can all smile at the fact that a nuclear weapon is described as Project Unity. So that's what the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Plan is described as. And so this is the top of the deal. I believe I'm the first person to have requested the EdTIF agreement based on my communications with the government. It says, quote, Project Unity anticipates bringing approximately 2,250 full-time employees with an annual salary of $104,000. So that sounds, wow, impressive. Wow, factory teeming with people, and they're all making six figures. Then I got towards the bottom. Then later on in the agreement, you see, okay, it depends on you. To receive the subsidy, you need to meet X, Y, and Z. That's spelled out in attachment B. So I said, oh, what is it now? It's on attachment B. This is what the state of Utah gave me. It was redacted. So I couldn't even figure out what the job creation claim was supposed to be. And this really blew my mind because it's the heart of the agreement. I mean, so you can put out press releases saying this is a deal creating 2,250 jobs. And then I go to get the actual agreement that spells it out, and the government is insisting on redacting it. I appealed once. They removed some of the sillier redactions they had, but insist on redacting this page. I was very fortunate that I've been able to line up 2 attorneys to represent me pro bono, and we've now appealed, and we'll be having a hearing, we expect, at the what's called the State Records Committee, hopefully in the next few months. So I'm giving this workshop to encourage you guys to request these kind of agreements across the country, and hopefully you don't get this, but yeah, sometimes you end up here. So what would you guys do if you want to start gathering information about subsidies to your local defense contractors? You can do like Ken and many of his neighbors did and attend a meeting for public comment if there is one. So Ken, from what I recall him telling me, there was a notice in the newspaper, public comment for incentives for an aerospace company on whatever day. And they were able to read between the lines, understand, oh, incentives for an aerospace company. This sounds like subsidies for a defense contractor. And they were correct. And it was a very lively, raucous meeting held during the pandemic when people were calling in virtually. After, if there is a meeting for public comment in Utah, there was not. And Utah State Board met and posted their minutes afterward, but there was no members of the public present. You can then go about requesting the relevant documents. So you can go request that economic development agreement, the actual contract that I showed you some samples of. You can request the minutes and the audio from the board meeting that approved the subsidies. And this doesn't necessarily, this is not necessarily like a FOIA issue. This is something they really are supposed to hand over to you. So I've requested these in a few locations, and sometimes it's an email. Hi, I announcing this project. May I have the economic development agreement? Okay, here it is on an attachment. Sometimes it's buried somewhere on the internet and you may or may not actually be able to find it unless somebody in the government points you toward it. So for example, the Raytheon agreement in North Carolina, you would have to know the date it happened at the county commission, you go through their minutes and then you find the PDF of it. The minutes and audio from the board meeting that approved the subsidies in Utah, this was officially online, but you would never have found it unless, now finally, when someone actually told me the date that it occurred, then I could finally open up all the documents, go through the full, do the rigmarole, and then I found the meeting, and it was fascinating. You can then also request the annual performance reports or audits for these deals. So what's the government supposed to do? If the company says we're creating that number of jobs with this and that average salary, the government is every year will be auditing the company to see if they meet those goals and give them the subsidy. I will say already twice I've had 2 local governments tell me, no, those audits are secret and we will not give them to you, but it is good to at least ask for them. And I think, for anyone here who's not very familiar with requesting, public documents, what I think is nice to know is you don't need to be particularly clever about it. You don't even need to have a big organization behind you. public records law just says you're allowed to request it. So you don't have to say, I'm a reporter with this big media outlet. You don't have to have some great logic. Just say, hi, I'd like that document. That's all you have to do. And the onus is on the government to then give it to you or tell you why they're not giving it to you. And if they don't give it to you, the textbook answer that we learn in journalism school is, or in our courses, is you say, okay, since you didn't give it to me, can you cite the statute that allows you to not give it to me? And then that's where sort of the public records battle begins. Another fun thing you can do, which I did in Utah, is, like I said, local officials are routinely signing non-disclosure agreements with companies as they negotiate these deals, which is, as you can imagine, a way to very much exclude the public from knowing what's going on until it's basically a done deal. But since the government signed it, you can request that too. And that led me down to a strange place in Utah where the government told me, well, they said that they were not able to find their old NDA and therefore signed a new one. And the new NDA was signed in just a matter of days after my records request, which was pretty bonkers. The other thing you guys can do, which Reject Raytheon has done very well in Asheville, is just know that what you're seeing in this document may really just be the tip of the iceberg. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that. But if they're getting subsidies from the local government, the county government, they may also be getting it from the state government. There may also be sort of in-kind deals. And I'll give some examples of those in North Carolina. So what goes on in these meetings to approve subsidies? I enjoyed listening in on these, so I put some clips on them. When the public's not involved, behind closed doors, this is the audio that I obtained of the board meeting to approve subsidies for the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Plant for Northrop Grumman in Utah. And I apologize, the quality is not that great, but this is what the Utah government provided me. So I'm going to play this here. Oh, and the person who's speaking is a top state official who negotiated the deal.
Yeah.
Can't hear the sound coming in, Taylor.
It's broken.
Oh, it's broken? Hold on. You can't hear it at all? Shoot. Hold on. Let me see.
Just a word here and there.
Let me see if you can hear this next one, if it's just the bad quality. Tell me if you hear this one.
You are live now.
Okay. My name is Ken Brown, and I live in Illinois. A big project that is nothing to cheer for. With the promise of 800 jobs justified getting into bed with one of the largest oil profiteers in the world. Raytheon, Pratt & Whitney's parent company, is responsible for the deadly F-35.
Kind of muffled, Taylor. It's hard to hear.
That's too bad. Anyhow, I apologize. It's hard to hear. The Northrop Grumman one in Utah, what I discovered upon listening to the audio is that several inaccuracies went unchecked in the board meeting to approve these subsidies. For example, the state official who negotiated them referred to this as a missile defense project. So for anyone who's not as a weapons geek, missile defense refers to a category of weapons used to shoot down an incoming missile. But the ICBM is not missile defense, it's the nuclear weapon itself. He then also calls Northrop Grumman the largest employer in the state and says their employment levels would be up to about 8,000 in the state. And then I just did some checking on the Utah Workforce Services site, and there's multiple employers with larger, larger workforces in Utah. And I brought that one up because this is something I've heard several times in the context of defense contractors in the local level. They'll be described as the largest employer in town, and it just tends to not be true. The largest employer in a given district is generally a hospital system, a school system, a community college, a university, or the government itself. The next one, I was playing Ken calling in to the period for public comment for the Raytheon subsidies in North Carolina. And it's just fantastic. I posted an image of the meeting below. It's this staid, routine, procedural government meeting. And, the public caught on that they were about to offer subsidies to Raytheon, and they were, displeased to hear this. And about, I believe, 20 people called in opposition, and they're talking about the war in Yemen. They're talking about the F-35. And I just thought it was an extraordinary way that they connected their sort of local issues to, to very international ones, because indeed they were about to be on the tab for, millions of dollars to subsidize this company. And it just seems to have changed the narrative so much on the local level. And I've sort of followed how this has played out in North Carolina, and I imagine other people on this webinar are familiar. But yeah, I think the story of incentives to a high-tech aerospace company has, the narrative has changed now and heads to subsidies for Raytheon, which makes many weapons of war. And that Ken and the people who called in were sort of the impetus to changing that narrative from the beginning. So this, I said I was going to talk a little bit about the value that local watchdogs can add. Like I said, what you see in a given economic development agreement may just be the tip of the iceberg. There may be plenty of other subsidies that the company is receiving to come in. So Ken and his crowd were able to point me to several other things that they believe the company was receiving. So they were receiving subsidies both from the county government and from the state government. They're receiving sort of in-kind subsidies related to worker training at the community college that would serve the plant. They received funds from a foundation for economic development that stems from a historic tobacco settlement. Interestingly, this one, they were receiving a sort of a bridge project or a transportation project that would largely serve the plant, of course, but on the taxpayer dime. When I listened into the board meeting in Utah, it also seemed that perhaps Northrop Grumman may be getting something similar in terms of a road or transportation project. So anyhow, I think this is the added value, in addition to requesting the economic development agreement, just being astute and trying to figure out what else they're getting is sort of the value added of being on the ground and knowing, you're knowing your town and knowing what the company is up to. So I've sort of talked a bit about the value of these agreements and how this is sort of the tool we can use to sort of look into job creation claims, scrutinize them, and then, of course, like Ken's group has done in North Carolina, start changing the narrative. But as a starting point, how do you even know if military contractors are being subsidized in your area? So the first key thing to look at is, any ribbon cutting shovel photos like the one I showed you of Northrop Grumman in Utah, of politicians and corporate representatives. The keyword is incentives. That's sort of the code word. The layman word is subsidy. The word used kind of in a political or corporate world is incentives. And so, we're thrilled that our incentives have drawn Northrop Grumman and this advanced aerospace company to Utah, yada, yada. There's already your key that the company is receiving subsidies, and that's, you can go request through economic development agreement. I really love this resource. The Pentagon itself has an agency called the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation that publishes state spending profiles, where you can look and see who are the major contractors in your state. It'll sort of show a heat map for spending. I remember when I first looked at it for Alabama, the heat map over Huntsville was dense red, hence its nickname the Pentagon of the South. There's 2 trade magazines that cover this issue, one called Site Selection, another called Area Development. So you could research your state, your town, and get an idea of who is expanding or relocating to the area. I also have made a Google Doc of expansions and relocations of major military contractors, the top 5 since 2010. I did this for a story I'm working on about expansions and relocations into right to work states, but it sort of doubles as a document that will let you know who's coming into your state. And I'm both going to post it in the chat, and Ken said you can send it out afterward. And then, of course, if you get the EDAs and any of the annual performance reports, please send them to me, because I would like to know what they say and flag anything interesting you find in them. So thank you very much. And I would love to answer any questions. Oh, hold on.
All right, thanks so much. And go ahead, Pat. It's up to you.
Cool. Thanks so much to Ken first for organizing this, to Taylor for all that excellent info. Again, I'm Pat. I'm the Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project, which is based in Washington, D.C. We're a research and advocacy organization that works on policies to reduce corporate power. So I've been tracking these so-called economic development subsidies, and I'm very intentionally putting those in scare quotes because that's not what they are, for a long time now. First as a journalist like Taylor, now as a policy advocate. I first came to this work actually not through the defense side, but through, oddly enough, the sports side. I was covering the fallout of the financial crisis in 2008 and the ensuing Great Recession, and noticed that the city of Detroit at the time, when they were literally turning off streetlights and cutting pensions for not just future retirees, but current retirees, were subsidizing the owner of Little Caesars Pizza to help him build a hockey arena for the Detroit Red Wings. And so that was my introduction to this issue. And once you start going down the rabbit hole, you realize that this problem of corporate subsidies is everywhere, all across the economy. So I want to zoom out a little bit, put some more context around what Taylor explained, lay out some key points in the process that you can watch out for so you can get involved in these state and local corporate subsidy fights against defense contractors, but also against all sorts of big businesses, because this is a really big problem. It's actually $95 billion are spent annually all across the country between state and local governments on specific corporate subsidies. This is a specific government gift to a specific company for a specific action, $95 billion between state and local every single year. New York, Louisiana, and Michigan lead the way, but every single state participates in some way or another. I saw some folks in the chat from Baltimore who, boy, got a problem with this there. I saw someone from upstate New York. We could have an entire webinar on the corporate subsidy follies of upstate New York. And for North Carolina, where I know a lot of our folks are from, we're talking about $10.5 billion dating back to about the mid 80s was when it really first started rolling, but most of that money has come since 2014. We've seen over the last several decades a really large growth in this sort of spending. And to be clear, I'm using corporate subsidy as a kind of catch-all for a lot of different forms of public spending on corporate interests. And we can get into kind of some of the various forms that it takes, but I'm using that as a just kind of catch-all term. We call them economic development subsidies. People call them business subsidies. People call them corporate welfare. There's all sorts of names. So to be clear, these subsidies cause all sorts of harms to workers, local businesses, taxpayers. We can get into some of the specifics. But one of the largest, right, is that local investments just simply go begging. States and localities, almost always by constitutional fiat, have to balance their budgets. So if you're spending several $billion on a new defense plant, that's several $billion you don't have to spend on other things. And as the evidence shows, you don't actually get anything for the investment in the defense plant, the electric vehicle factory, the Amazon warehouse, the Walmart that often gets paid by the public to be built in a particular place. These corporate subsidies take all sorts of forms. One of the most popular is a property tax break, right? Taylor, I'm sure, has seen this all the time. A plant comes in and will get 80% off of their property tax for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But this also includes job credits, create 5,000 jobs, you get $2,000 per job. And then also, as Taylor mentioned, there's a lot of backdoor kind of subsidies, such as below cost land. Taylor mentions specific infrastructure being built to a plant that wouldn't need to be built otherwise. And that's not just roads and bridges, that's sewers, that's electrical lines, that's all sorts of stuff. But also breakoffs on utilities. You'll often see that these large projects get below cost utilities for their water, for their power. And those agreements are often secret. And so you can't find out about them until, 25 years later, the local utility wonders why they're underwater. And it's because the Google data center on the street has been paying full freight for its water for a decade. So what does the evidence say about these deals? What does not go up? Anything that we actually care about. Incomes, job creation, investments. Tons of people have looked at this. There have been loads of studies by real economists. I am not one, but there have been lots of real ones that looked at this stuff. They did not find any real noticeable effect for this deal. So that's $95 billion between state and local governments every year buying almost nothing. But what does go up? Corruption and income inequality. In fact, some of the most heavily subsidized businesses can harm all of the things we care about. There have been recent studies about Walmart and Amazon, two of the most heavily subsidized companies in the country, and how their entrance into a market actually causes wages to go down, causes the workforce labor participation rate to go down, causes local businesses to close, causes all sorts of these bad things to happen. And why does that happen? One, big business honestly just takes most of this money. Defense contractors is a very concentrated industry, right? There are only a handful of players, so almost of necessity in that industry, the money's all going to be flowing to big, entrenched, dominant players. But that's true across, right? In retail, most of the money goes to Amazon, Walmart, Target, Lowe's, Home Depot, and you can just sort of name check each industry, and that's true. But the other really interesting fact that research has found is that most of the investments that big businesses make when they are subsidized would have been made in the absence of those subsidies. So 75 to 98% of subsidized projects would have gone to exactly the same place without the subsidy, because honestly, there are lots of other reasons that a business decides to locate in a particular place, right? You need a particular workforce, you need a particular piece of land, you need particular infrastructure, access to supply chains, access to airports, access to highways, whatever the case may be. So there are loads of reasons that have nothing to do with your tax rate that you make an investment in a particular place. But corporations have gotten really good at pretending that their tax rate is the thing that matters most. And then, as I said, corruption goes up because the process is necessarily corrupt, right? These are individual deals between politicians and specific corporations. You have to almost have a too cozy arrangement between the political actors and the business that's receiving the subsidies. And that's even more true in the heavily concentrated industries, of which defense is one of them, right? Because when you're only talking a handful of players, they're just the same 5 people essentially showing up in room after room, meeting house, meeting area after meeting area, collecting this money. The Kansas City Fed actually did a study on this in 2011 and found a direct correlation between state spending on corporate subsidies and elected officials being convicted on federal corruption charges. It was just like a straight line that went through. And again, that makes sense, right? This is just of necessity too cozy. I saw someone asked about this in the chat, so I'm going to go like a little more into detail than I probably would have otherwise. But there's also a clear line between campaign contributions and corporate subsidies. I'm going to read one stat specifically. When a state starts dishing out large subsidies, which is defined as a big jump from the historical baseline, annual campaign contributions increase by about 20% from lobbyists and lawyers who represent large firms, and about 106% from large business advocacy and trade organizations. So you're getting this virtuous circle of money going into campaigns and coming out in the form of corporate subsidies, and round and round and round it goes. So why, right? Like why? And honestly, I don't think that the campaign contributions are the real thing. I'm going to get into what actually keeps this system alive when, again, all of the evidence says this doesn't work. You know, economics is one of those things, right, where people fight about all sorts of things. The old joke about Truman wanting a one-handed economist because he was tired of economists saying on the one hand, but on the other hand, not true in this area. Economists have looked at this stuff upside down, backwards, forwards. No one who hasn't been bought and paid for by the industry has found a sustainable economic effect from this spending. But what have they found? A sustainable political effect. It is simply the case that incumbent politicians who engage in more corporate deal making of this sort gain more votes in future elections. One of my favorite, and by that I mean most horrifying stats about corporate subsidies is that, and I know the folks here from Asheville have heard me talk about this before, is that if you want to predict if your state is going to increase its corporate subsidy spending in a given year, don't look at any economic indicator. Don't look at poverty, don't look at job creation, don't look at GDP, don't look at anything like that. Simply check and see if your incumbent governor is up for re-election. If your incumbent governor is up for re-election, there's a much, much, much higher chance your state is going to increase its subsidy spending that year, because these are political tools, not economic. And you can see how that works, right? You can build real political capital with these things, like Taylor was talking about. You get to send out a press release claiming you created all these jobs. You get your picture on the front of the paper. You get often very laudatory, cheesy coverage in local press. I'm not even bashing local journalists, folks who don't have a lot of time. The local press has been gutted. They're trying to dash out something as fast as they can. So they just repeat everything that the company and the politician said at the event, put a picture of the ribbon cutting, boom. That's worth something to politicians, right? That's a useful political tool. You get to tweet about how you're creating all these jobs and doing these great things. And then also, honestly, and this is one of the hardest things, it kind of sounds right. Like, we'll invest a little bit of public money in this plant, and in return, we will get jobs and investment, and our property values will go up, and all these good things will happen. Even though all the research says it's not true, it has a sort of common sense soundingness to it, which makes it really hard to fight back against. And I want to be clear about something, even though I consider myself a progressive or a liberal, depending on the term of art at the moment. This isn't like a red blue thing. You heard at the top when I talked about the states that spend the most, New York and Louisiana. Doesn't get much more red or blue than that. It's much more an elite versus not thing, plugged in insiders versus outsiders type thing. I work across the country on this issue, and honestly, I work with Democrats in the deep blue states. I work with Republicans in deep red states, both parties in some purple states, and it really is about who is in the process and can game the system, and who can't. And folks like us are the ones who are on the outside looking in and who can't get plugged into all that money. And not for nothing, right? That's usually the case for most local businesses. And that's one of the most harmful effects of these things, is that your local business doesn't get access to the sort of money to create jobs and expand facilities and open new factories that a Northrop Grumman gets, that a Raytheon gets, that a Walmart gets, that an Amazon gets. And then one last thing, and I think is important here, right? And when we're talking about the political potency of this, and again, Taylor's kind of touched on this, defense industry gets a rah-rah effect, right? There's something politically dangerous often about opposing the defense industry. And so that effect, I imagine, though I haven't seen any studies on this, would be even more profound in these deals because of that kind of woohoo, rah-rah, patriotism, how can you be against the troops kind of thing that we've all seen and experienced over the last several decades in the US. So what can you do? First rule, do everything that Taylor said. I should just stop now and quit. But I'm not going to do that. You can check other databases. Taylor included a couple of really great ones. Our friends at Good Jobs First have a really great subsidy tracker. You can sort by state, county, individual companies, look up, see what's going on in your neck of the woods, just to get a sense of what's happening. And that's a really good and useful tool. And then there are 3 phases of the process where there are moments that you can jump in. The first is the negotiation phase. And as Taylor said, you'll often be goofy code names behind the projects at this place. We had Project Unity. My favorite is always Project Mastodon, which was an Amazon warehouse, because of course it was. But you can usually get a sense that something is happening, right? Either because there are like corporate suits around who usually wouldn't be, or because things like a random rezoning is happening, right? A parcel of land that was just sitting there suddenly gets rezoned to industrial. So like, what the heck is going on? I'm actually going to drop in the chat, assuming I can pull it up here quick, a little organizing guide myself and a colleague put together about what to do during the negotiation phase. There are a bunch of really good tactics in there before the project is public that you can use to try and shine a light on it. So once it is public, which isn't always the case, a lot of times these deals have no public process until they're done, but oftentimes places do have some sort of public meeting requirement, 60-day, before implementation requirement, where you can get a chance to get some face time with electeds to talk about these deals. I encourage people to do that and to ask really the kind of key questions that Taylor was getting at. Exactly how many jobs are binding and not just maybe kind of sort of? What is the wage for everyone? Is it getting dragged up by the CEO's pay getting included in this? What are you paying for your utilities? What sort of community benefits? Do you have requirements to hire locally or not? And honestly, just ask, did you even need the money? Because sometimes the businesses will goof and say no. There was a case actually today in New York where a state senator in New York was talking about a deal where the company literally on its application checked, no, we do not need this money to make this expansion, and yet received it anyway. So like just putting them on the spot with that kind of silly, goofy sounding question can be really useful. And then there's the implementation phase. So right, at that point, a deal's been done, but there are still steps along the way where you can intervene. And they're actually in the Pratt & Whitney, and thank you, Ken, for highlighting this for me, right? Pratt & Whitney recently missed an investment target for some of the incentives that it's supposed to be getting for its North Carolina plant. What often happens at this phase is that the folks in charge of the deal, whether they be in elected office or kind of economic development bureaucrats, will go back and renegotiate it so that the missed investment is no longer a missed investment, or that they get more time, or whatever the case may be. Shining a public light on that and making sure that that doesn't happen, or at least making it really embarrassing if it does happen, is a really useful tool. And then you can push for higher level reforms. And I'm going to drop one more thing in the chat. I'm giving you a lot of homework, which I'm not really sorry about. This is a toolkit that I developed. It's mostly aimed at state houses, but it could also be applicable at the county level for a bunch of different reforms that can be implemented to get a handle on what I call the corporate subsidy machine. So there's a bunch of stuff in there. Please get in touch with me if any of it looks interesting or applicable in your place. I'm happy to point you towards the right state house folks or the right on the ground organizations to try and get a bunch of that stuff implemented. And it's all really useful. Some of it is transparency. Some of it is just banning the most egregious corporate subsidy practices, but there's a lot of good stuff in there, including getting more local governments involved, getting local school boards involved, who often bear the brunt of these sort of policies. Bunch of stuff in there, which would be really helpful in most places in the country. And so if you're all interested, please drop me a line. And hopefully we can make some things happen. And I'm going to leave it there so we can have 7 minutes plus for questions. How do we do, Ken?
That's great. That's great, Pat. Thanks a lot. And same to you, Taylor. All right, so let's have those questions if you've got them. What we'll do, and we'll do raising of hands like down below in the reaction button, reaction choice in the panel of the Zoom panel. There's a choice that says raise hand. Like you can see Melody's doing it and Quanta's doing it on the screen right now. It brings you to the top. And what we'll do is just take one at a time. And let me encourage you to please, if you have a comment, be brief with the comment. And also please have a question for Taylor and Pat to respond to. So we'll see how long this goes. We can go for a little while, over the hour if you like. And Melody, you go ahead. You're first.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some things as an outgrowth of our local group here in Asheville. There's a small group of us that are working initially on sort of an initiative to ban the secret deals, because the Pratt & Whitney deal there was no transparency whatsoever. But I've been doing some research on that in preparation for a meeting that Ann Craig and I had. Ann's on this call too, had with our actual representative to the North Carolina General Assembly, and he's a freshman, so he is still learning himself about all of these things, which was actually a good place to be, because he was interested in learning more about what we had to say. And so in my research, what I've discovered in North Carolina, which may be true in some other places, is that the approach to economic development in general shifted about 8 years ago. What that meant in North Carolina is that the accountability is for any economic development grant from the state. The expectations are minimal. And for example, it's how many jobs they're going to create, how many they're going to retain, salary. And on one of the programs, that's it. Nothing more than that. Which means that that's probably fairly easy for companies to meet if they're actually creating the business or expanding, either one, because there's no requirement to say, they're not even FTEs. It's just the number of jobs. And the other thing is that North Carolina before 2014 was actually sort of at the top of the game in terms of evaluating their economic development programs. This is according to the Pew. And since then, they're at the bottom. So at one point in history anyway, and there are states in the country that are actually doing a good job evaluating their economic development programs to see if they're working beyond just the very minimal performance indicators like jobs and salaries. And I bring this up because in our state, which is the General Assembly is completely Republican, so there's not a lot of chance that we're going to be able to propose, or any of our representatives who are our local representatives are all sympathetic to this, that they can propose anything that's going to go very far, because it'll just get tabled. But and we ask our representative this, that if you ask for a study of their economic development programs, it's hard for even people across the political spectrum to say no to seeing whether it's to hold them accountable for the money that's being spent. So I just wanted to share that from things we're doing here in Asheville.
So no question, Melody?
No question.
Okay. Okay, Quanta.
Melody does great and important work. We should always just listen to her too.
Thank you. I'm going to ask something. For 50 minutes, we listened to data and information, and I know that you really had to kind of cram it in there. But if you really want to inspire, I hope that the goal is to get public attention and to inspire them to take action. People who are in here are like-minded, and we are here and we're trying to patiently listen to everything. But I'll be honest with you, I'm 77, and all that you have said to me right now kind of tired my mind, because, you know, but I came here to not just listen to data, but I came here to see how I can be inspired and how I can take an action, inspire others as well. So communication is absolutely important. So I would say that first we need to know what the goal is and what you want us to do and how do you want us to do it. But this data and speaking of almost an hour about it, quite frankly, doesn't cause inspiration and action. So I'm trying to be honestly give a critique to be helpful, not to criticize. I just want you to know that. Thank you.
Okay, Taylor or Pat, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I'll just tell a story that maybe will make this a little more real. It happened in Maryland, about an hour and a half outside of Washington, D.C., where folks saw the sort of things that I was talking about. Corporate suits started showing up. The town council was being really shady and holding a bunch of non-public meetings. There were real estate folks poking around, asking in this relatively agricultural section of the state to buy up land. So everyone thought something kind of fishy was going on. And it turned out that it was Amazon coming to build a publicly subsidized data center here. Again, this kind of beautiful part of Maryland, which is really still truly agricultural. And so this guy who was just a Christmas tree farmer started organizing his neighbors and friends to get together to first figure out what the heck this project was, but then see what they could do to stop it once they realized that it was going to be this kind of loud, ugly, giant parking lot around it, horrible Amazon facility. And so what they came up with, and this is sort of gets into a little bit of what I was talking about, points in the process to interject yourself, is that they used Maryland, which has a fairly good open meetings law. They basically petitioned the state open meetings board to say that the town and county councils had been meeting illegally with Amazon. And so therefore they should have to go back and start the whole process over again. And the state open meetings board agreed and actually said, yes, those were illegal meetings. Your public officials were illegally meeting with Amazon. You should have been allowed to sit in and hear what was going on. And Amazon ultimately pulled the plug on the project, and they kind of straight up cited like, whoa, there's going to have to be public input into this process. Like, we're not here for that. We don't do that. Like, we're getting out of here. And so the community was actually able to use these kind of funky, wonky sounding laws to get what they wanted in their community, which was preserving open space, preserving farmland, not getting this big, nasty, worthless data center in their backyard. And so like, that's the sort of thing that I'm hoping folks take away from this. It can often feel like you're like, right, we're going up against Jeff Bezos, who makes more money in 10 minutes than most of us are going to make in our entire lives. We're going up against the defense industrial complex. We're going up against these kind of giant behemoths. And so it can kind of feel like you can't do anything, but there are moments when you can jump into this process and be successful and stand up for your community. And that was just a recent example that I found really inspiring. Again, just this guy who's just a Christmas tree farmer was like, I'm not letting this happen in my yard without having sort of say. They used this kind of, funky, not often brought up law to stop the project. And so I'm hoping that's what folks take away, is that there are moments in this where you can interject yourself and both shine attention on these things and use laws that are on the books to actually stop things from happening.
Yeah, I'd also like to add that I appreciate the question, because I'm, as a journalist, I sort of jump to the sort of mechanics of how to get this done. But just zooming out, I mean, I think if you're, on this webinar, you're pretty aware of just the extreme political power that major military contractors have. It's a very, very David and Goliath situation, and we have so few tools for accountability and transparency. we don't get to go knock on the doors. I don't get to go walk into Northrop Grumman's headquarters or go walk into their plant and start talking to workers. I mean, secrecy abounds. And so I've liked this issue of economic development because it is, like Pat said, an area where we do get to jump in and get to assert that little democratic right we have, which says, oh, no, are we subsidizing you? Okay, you've got some documents you owe me now. And we get to start the process of some accountability. I've seen it play out well in Asheville, and I'm so impressed with how you guys have changed the narrative on the ground. Utah is TBD because, as you saw, they just redacted the document for me.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a couple more hands here. Here's Jackie Cabasso, is it, Jackie? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. Thank you both for tremendous presentations, really helpful. I wear many hats, as do many of you. Locally, in Oakland, California. I'm the executive director of Western States Legal Foundation. I'm the national co-convener of United for Peace and Justice, and I'm also the North American coordinator of Mayors for Peace. So first of all, I think these tools are incredibly valuable to empower people to do work at the local level, because clearly we're not being terribly effective at the national level. So kudos for that. Secondly, I want to appeal to everyone. Part of what our job is to change the narrative. So I would really appeal to everyone to stop referring to defense contracts and defense contractors as if they're about defense, because they're not. They're about military, they're about war profiteers. So military contractors, war profiteers. I think so small things can change the narrative in the same way as, when we talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to always say the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not just the atomic bombing. So these are small things. The other thing I want to appreciate, again, from the presenters, though, is that this problem is not limited to war profiteer contractors. It's across the whole economy, and you've brought that out to us very clearly. And that can help us expand our collaborations, perhaps, with other issue constituencies if we keep that bigger picture in mind. And I forgot to say, I'm also at the California Poor People's Campaign, and it's kind of in that hat that I was watching tonight to think about informing some of our California campaign activities. So sorry, there's not really a question there, but those are just a few thoughts. Thanks.
All right, Jackie.
Actually
Pat or Taylor, did you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, I think there's an important point there, which is that you can, on this stuff, build kind of funky coalitions. And so I think that's just like a really important thing to bring out. It is, and oftentimes, right, kind of smaller local business who you don't generally think of as a kind of like progressive bastion, but are on some of the front lines of getting harmed by these things. So they can often be helpful, even though you may disagree with their politics on a lot of things in this particular area. And like I said, it's depending on where you are, it can be a really kind of weird bipartisan issue. So yeah, I just would like very much encourage folks to look for allies on this in strange places.
Okay, good. Okay, Chuck Kestner, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both for the presentation today. Very interesting. We in Michigan, I live in the Detroit area. We have a Senator, Gary Peters. So you know him. I don't know most of you probably know he's a real war hawk. And they always he seems to be very protective of Selfridge Air Force Base here. It's a National Guard base in the metro area. And I know Burlington, Vermont's had some trouble with the F-35s, from the residents. We've talked about the defense industry or the, weapons manufacturers, whatever you want to call them. But I was curious about that, even when they shot that balloon down over Lake Huron, I think they used a plane from Wisconsin. They didn't even use it from the one from Michigan, which was where it was supposed to be. Yeah. I'm just saying, it seems to me that that's another boondoggle, these based states. And as anybody, there's been talk for years about closing our Selfridge, but it never gets done. And about the money and the wasteful spending, and is this a repository for planes, unneeded planes, that they can use the excuse to manufacture? I was wondering if anybody you know, we've talked about the weapons manufacturers. I'm wondering about the bases, maybe National Guard, or even on the national level, like naval bases, Air Force bases locally, and how that's affecting us in terms of our dollars, you know, and needless spending.
I'm happy to answer that. First, there are, I can already top at the top of my head, 3 really good books on the topic. One called Salvaging Community, which was an academic study that looked at the BRAC process, which you're probably familiar with, which was the process post-Cold War of, you know, Congress coming together and deciding what base capacity was unnecessary and what they would close. And it was a way to sort of circumvent the sort of, individual members of Congress freaking out if their base was closed. So the book Salvaging Community sort of looks at the afterlives of closed bases. A scholar named Miriam Pemberton has a nice new book out called 6 Stops on the National Security Tour. I'll post my review of it. That talks about kind of more broadly about, of course, local economies reliant on defense spending and what happens when it dries up. Also, the book that I posted a quote from on the beginning of my presentation, Sustainable Regeneration of Former Military Sites, had several nice essays about the BRAC process. I'll also post a story myself. I did a story about sort of base military site closures post-Cold War and their afterlives, and some of them do go on to prosperous afterlives. One very nice case comes from Maine, Brunswick, Maine, which has reinvented its former Naval Air Station into sort of industrial park isn't the right word, but, you know, into a high-tech hub, including several green technology startups, including like a water power startup. Anyhow, I'll happily post my story. I think there's both, like I said, good academic work on this topic, particularly the book Salvaging Community, which is a sort of thorough academic look at the afterlives of shuttered bases. And I'll happily post my story, which will be, you know, a more anecdotal one about a shuttered base that indeed had a prosperous afterlife.
Good. And that reminds me, Taylor, and also Pat, Taylor, has been a request for your slides. And you just said you would send some links, and maybe you're going to put them in the chat. But also, Pat, you posted some links, and I'm going to send an email follow-up to this to all of you who registered. And if you would send me those, or I'll get them out of the chat, but if you would send me those links, I'll put them in my email, and everybody, even those who aren't here tonight, will get them because I'm going to send them to those who registered. So all of you can look forward to those links coming to you in an email. And let's make Melody our last person to make a comment and a question. And go ahead, Melody.
Yeah, I actually do have a question. Pat, I wondered if you could tell the group about the interstate compact that was initiated in 2021 so that people know that it took place and that there might be some energy around it in the future, so that, because it's certainly something some people could lobby for.
Totally. Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a good one. So there was a few years ago an effort to sort of circumvent the political problem of corporate subsidies, right? Which, as I talked about, right, they're really potent political tools. And so no one wants to be the kind of first to put down that political tool. They don't want to unilaterally disarm. So there was an effort amongst a group of state lawmakers to form what's called the Interstate Compact against corporate tax giveaways, which would be a kind of mutual agreement amongst states that were a state to enter this compact, they would agree not to use corporate subsidies to poach a business from any other state that was also in the compact. So you could basically agree not to have your businesses poached from a state, as long as you agreed not to do the same thing to them. Sort of like, you know, it's kind of unfortunate terminology with this crowd, right? Mutual disarmament agreement on corporate subsidies. And so there were bills introduced in about a dozen states over the last few years. Unfortunately, the guy who's led the organizing around it was like doing it in his spare time because he cares about the issue and like had to like go do his job and raise his kids, so it doesn't lead it anymore. And so we're hoping to get it back off the ground in a few years, but it's a really sort of promising approach because these things happen all the time where states make agreements to have, you know, like it's the reason that doctors' licenses are respected across state borders. It's the reason that lawyers can wave into state bars across state lines. There are tons of interstate compacts around things like water rights and other natural resources. So it makes sense to kind of use this as a tool. And it would be, again, a way to short circuit the political problem of subsidies, which is that that they just can be very, very potent re-election tools. And this is modeled off of, this is going to be a kind of goofy story. So the Kansas City metro area straddles the state line between Kansas and Missouri. And for years, companies were literally just hopping back and forth across the line to collect subsidies. They would move 3 miles down the road, collect a bunch of money, hire nobody new. A bunch of people just had to change their commute. A few years later, they'd move back across the state line, collect a bunch of money again, literally would just boop, 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 boop. For years, this went on. Finally, Kansas and Missouri got together and said, this is absurd. We can't let this keep happening, and came to this agreement that no company that was leaving one state for the other was going to collect subsidies. You couldn't play this game and play the two states off against each other. So the compact would be basically taking that idea and nationalizing it. And I think a way to start would be kind of regionally, right? You can see a world in which the states in the upper Midwest all agree not to push from each other. Or in the Northeast, it would make perfect sense for like a New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island to get together and not do this anymore. One of my, again, favorite horrifying stats is there's a building just across I'm from northern New Jersey, so this one hits really close to home. There's a building just across the border in northern New Jersey in New York State that has been used hundreds of times by companies claiming they were going to move there in order to collect subsidies from New Jersey. So New Jersey would pay them not to leave. They were all claiming that they were going to go to this exact same building, exact same nondescript office building in the middle of nowhere in New York. And so the compact is a way to get around this like ridiculous goofiness in a way that politicians can still feel good about. So I'm hoping that the effort gets a little fire lit back under it in the coming years. The people who are behind it are really committed to it. Two champions I want to shout out are Representative Bob Morgan in Illinois and Representative Anna Escamani in Florida. They're both fantastic on this issue in general, but they are two of the real prime believers in this interstate compact. And so I really love to see it happen. And thank you for the question, Melody. That's a good one.
Okay, I think that's a good one to end on too. That's a great sort of hopeful story, right? States getting together to stop those subsidies. So I think we should call it a night, but before we do, Pat or Taylor, do you have any last words that you'd like to add, or give you the last word?
No, just thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for your interest in this issue. And like I said, if you turn up something, this is my job title, field reporter for the military industrial complex. So send me your EDAs, send me anything that jumps out at you. I believe largely if you request them, you're going to find some they fall short of promised job claims. So keep flagging them, raise the issue. And like I said, it's pretty unique value to do. That the fact that I appear to be the first person to request Northrop Grumman's EDA for the intercontinental ballistic missile is kind of sad. Like, I would wish hordes of people were requesting this, but apparently I was the first one. So I think if you guys go about doing this for your hometown military contractors, you also very well might be the first one.
Yeah, totally. Second that. Send all your things to Taylor. And then when you're ready to start lobbying State House, folks, drop me a line.
So good. Thank you, too. And thank you all for showing up. Let me remind you that WERN is going to do another webinar March 22nd, and it's on, sort of the bane of our lives right now, nuclear weapons. So we have a couple of great presenters there, too. So please, look for that. I'll send the word out about that, too. All right, you all. Good night, and thanks for coming, and great webinar. Peace out.